The State Department and United Nations have condemned the escalating deadly violence in Nicaragua. The U.S. has also imposed new visa restrictions on people involved in human rights abuses and others responsible for undermining democracy.
More than 200 people have been killed in anti-government protests and unrest since April. Demonstrators are demanding democratic reforms. There's also growing calls for President Daniel Ortega to step down and to hold early elections. Here to take us through the latest is CBSN contributor Alex Kliment. He writes for Signal, a newsletter produced by GZERO Media. Good to see you.
Likewise.
So we've been talking about this for quite some time here at CBS News. This wave of violence started after Ortega made changes to Social Security and pension programs. The mounting backlash has forced him to withdraw the measure, but the protests are continuing, and now we're seeing people that are dying. There's a humanitarian crisis going on. Will these protests have an impact on making any kind of genuine democratic reforms?
Well, one of the things that we've seen, we've seen this elsewhere in Latin America, in Venezuela in particular, is that if you are an unpopular leader, even if there are people in the streets and people being killed in mass chaos, you can hang on to power for an awfully long time, provided that you have one important thing, and that is the loyalty of the military. And Ortega still has that. He's been using government-backed paramilitaries to crack down on the protesters. And one big question is, will the military itself eventually intervene? And the situation has gotten worse and worse. I mean, there were peace talks brokered by the Catholic Church, which fell apart after the crackdown. Over the weekend, paramilitaries actually laid siege to a church complex and killed 2 people. I mean, it's a situation where a deeply unpopular and detached government, backed by military and paramilitaries, is facing off against a wide public protest comprising journalists, students, now even clergy, members of the private sector, which were formerly allied with him. It's a direct clash that can only be resolved really by force or by negotiation. And so far, Ortega has the side of force on his side.
So let's talk about his policies and how his policies led to this situation right now.
Yeah, well, Ortega's background is interesting. I mean, this guy has towered over Nicaraguan politics for most of the past half century, right? This is the guy who led the Marxist-Leninist Sandinista Liberation Front to power in 1979, right? Prompting a brutal civil war with CIA-backed paramilitaries. Remember Iran-Contra? Sure. All of that was going on in Nicaragua, right? He stepped down in the first post-war elections in 1990, went into opposition, sort of recast and rebranded himself as a kind of friendlier leftist, pro-business, devout Catholic, got himself elected in 2006, and since then has proceeded to systematically dismantle checks on his power. He appointed his wife vice president. He gave massive media powers to his children. He's removed term limits. He's banned opposition forces. That was okay so long as the economic situation was getting better, which, with help from Venezuelan oil and cash, Chinese investment, some IMF money, things were getting better for a while. Over the past couple of years, that economic kind of tailwind has petered out for the reasons that have affected Venezuela and other governments in Latin America, and he was left high and dry with this sort of political situation where he was deeply unpopular and had been rigging things in advantage. And the last straw was when he proposed this Social Security reform, which asked Nicaraguans, one of the poorest countries in Latin America, by the way, to pay more in Social Security taxes and receive less in benefits, right? That was the last straw. Right. Put people on the streets, they cracked down brutally. Even though they've rescinded that reform, the situation has just gotten worse, because it's no longer about the pension reform, it's about the violence and the crackdown and the illegitimacy of the Ortega government.
Where is the U.S. in all of this? Ortega claims that the protests are U.S.-backed. How is the United States viewing what's happening there?
Well, the United States has imposed sanctions on several members of the Ortega regime, let's call it, over the violence. 13 other Latin American states have condemned the violence. The history between Nicaragua and the United States is a pretty sordid one, right? I mean, when Ortega says this is a U.S.-backed plot to overthrow us, that triggers, and for good reason. I mean, the U.S. was, let's call it what it was meddling pretty directly in Central American and Latin American politics for most of the second half of the 20th century, and nowhere was that more egregious than in Nicaragua. So when he says that, it's more than a dog whistle. It's a direct reference to a very sordid history. Whether there's evidence that this is happening, hard to say. But what is certainly true is that An awful lot of journalists and young people and students and clergy are on the streets right now, and they don't look like they're funded by the CIA.
So then where are things going from here? I mean, what does the end look like?
Well, one of the proposals was to move up the next presidential election from 2021 to next March. Those talks seemed to be making progress earlier this spring. They were mediated by the Catholic Church, and then in a fresh spate of violence on the part of the government, more people were killed and the talks were broken off. So as of right now, there is no real meeting or dialogue going on between the opposition groups on the streets and the people that support them and the government itself.
Does he have any support
deadlock
amongst the people? I mean, sometimes you see support amongst the very poor, or is it strictly the military that's keeping him in power?
Well, you know, interestingly, up until a couple of years ago, Nicaragua was a country in Latin America that showed one of the highest approval ratings of the government, right? Because of the economic largesse, because of, I mean, Ortega lifted hundreds of thousands of people out of poverty since 2006. So he still does have support among some people, but it's plummeted rapidly, and what's really keeping him in power now is the backing of the military. Whether that sticks around is what we have to watch.
All right, I'm glad we're staying on top of this story.